Marisol had always trusted the quiet rhythm of her life, the predictable routine that made her house feel like a sanctuary. But that night, as she approached the front door, a strange heaviness pressed down on her chest. The street was eerily silent, the usual distant hum of traffic absent, replaced by a tense stillness that made her heart tighten. She fumbled with her keys, each click echoing unnaturally in the quiet, and a faint, acrid scent pricked at her nose. Smoke. Her brows knitted in confusion, but she shrugged it off. Perhaps someone had lit a fire in a neighbor's fireplace. She had no idea that the smoke she sensed was the prelude to a nightmare she could never have imagined. As she stepped inside, the familiar warmth of the house seemed wrong. The lights were dim, shadows stretching across the walls in ways they never had before. Her footsteps sounded hollow on the polished floor, echoing off the walls like distant warnings. "Alejandro?" she called softly, but the response was silence, broken only by the faint creak of movement upstairs. A sudden chill ran down her spine, and instinctively she knew something was very, very wrong. Before she could move further, the front door slammed shut behind her. The sound reverberated through the house, making her heart leap violently against her ribs. Marisol spun, and her eyes locked on Valeria, leaning casually against the doorway, her smirk cold and deliberate. Alejandro emerged from the shadows behind her, eyes glinting with a cruel light that made Marisol's stomach twist into knots. "You thought this home was safe?" he hissed, voice low and venomous. "Tonight, you'll learn your place." Panic surged, sharp and suffocating, but Marisol forced herself to breathe steadily. Fear would not paralyze her. Not tonight. Valeria's steps were precise and menacing as she moved closer, and in an instant, Marisol was shoved toward the center of the living room. Metal chains clinked ominously as she was restrained, wrists locked, and the cold bite of iron bit into her skin. Alejandro knelt beside her, his fingers brushing her face mockingly as he whispered, "This is the end of you, Marisol. No one will ever rescue you." The words were meant to terrify, but instead, they ignited something fierce inside her. The smell of smoke grew stronger. Flames licked at the edges of the room, curling up the walls and around the furniture with insidious intent. Heat pressed against her body, intense and suffocating. As in Marisol's mind raced, this wasn't a mistake. It was carefully orchestrated. Her husband and his mistress had planned every second of it, believing their cruelty could extinguish her life as easily as a match ignites kindling. But she refused to let it happen. Survival surged through her like a river breaking its banks, sharpening every sense, heightening every instinct. Her eyes darted around, searching desperately for anything that could serve as an escape. And then she saw it. A slight gap behind the bookshelf, narrow but passable. Smoke and fire hissed closer, and the chains rattled as she strained against them, testing their strength. Alejandro's laughter echoed, cruel and arrogant, assuming victory was already his. Sweat dripped down her face, mixing with soot as she manipulated the links inch by inch, on heart hammering in rhythm with the crackling flames. She worked methodically, carefully knowing one false move could mean death. Minutes passed like hours. Marisol's fingers trembled as she coaxed the chains loose, the fire's heat pressing against her from all sides. Smoke stung her eyes, searing her lungs, but she refused to succumb. Memories of every small skill she had honed over the years, unlocking tricky mechanisms, solving puzzles, escaping tight spots, flooded her mind, and she applied them with precision. Finally, with a twisting pull, the chains gave way. Freedom was inches away, but danger remained omnipresent. She crawled toward the vent, her body scraping against the rough wood and metal, every nerve on fire with pain and adrenaline. Flames roared, smoke thickened, and for a moment, yet despair threatened to overtake her, but not yet. With a final desperate push, she wriggled through the vent. Each scrape of her skin was agony, but it was agony she would endure for survival. The world outside awaited, a dark, silent refuge. She emerged onto the lawn, coughing violently, lungs screaming, body bruised and blistered, but alive. Behind her, the fire consumed everything, and inside, Alejandro and Valeria believed their plan had succeeded. They had underestimated her resolve, her intelligence, and her unwillingness to surrender. Marisol collapsed on the grass, pulling in ragged breaths, letting herself feel the raw, shivering triumph of survival. Her mind, already sharp and calculating, began to plan. This was not the end, it was the beginning. She would reclaim what was hers. She would bring Alejandro and Valeria to justice. It's not through reckless confrontation, but through meticulous preparation, evidence, and strategy. Their confidence and arrogance were their weaknesses, and she would exploit them fully. As the fire crackled behind her, painting the night sky with orange and red, Marisol rose unsteadily, her eyes fierce, determined. The pain in her arms and legs, the smoke in her lungs, the fear that had gripped her heart, none of it mattered now. They had tried to extinguish her life, but they had fanned the flames of her resolve instead. And Marisol knew, with a certainty that sent shivers down her spine, that the reckoning was coming. Tonight, she survived. Tomorrow, Alejandro and Valeria would pay. Marisol's body ached, her lungs still burning from smoke. But fear had transformed into a sharp, calculating focus. She couldn't afford to rest for long. Alejandro and Valeria were still out there, their arrogance as lethal as the fire they had set. She needed allies, evidence, and a plan. Pulling her phone from her coat pocket, she called Lucia, her closest friend and unwavering confidant. "I survived," she whispered, voice trembling yet resolute. "But they tried to kill me. I need your help." Lucia's calm, sharp voice immediately guided her, urging her to find a safe location and begin gathering proof before approaching the authorities. Marisol rented a small, nondescript room in the outskirts of the city, one that provided anonymity and space to plan. The world outside continued as usual, indifferent to the nightmare she had barely escaped, and that indifference became her shield. She began reconstructing every detail. Alejandro's patterns, Valeria's arrogance, the fire's timing, and each memory became a clue, every careless word or action a weapon. She organized her thoughts, writing down everything she remembered: the smell of smoke, the way the chains had cut into her wrists, the smugness in their eyes. She accessed her hidden email and cloud backups, recovering conversations and messages that Alejandro and Valeria thought they had deleted. There were hints of greed, planning, and manipulation, proof of premeditation. Each fragment of information strengthened her resolve, transforming panic into a meticulous strategy. Marisol was no longer just surviving. She was preparing to strike, to reclaim her life, and to ensure justice would follow. Neighbors and staff became crucial allies. Through discreet calls and coded messages, Marisol pieced together testimonies. The gardener had overheard Alejandro and Valeria discussing the final solution for her. A neighbor had seen Valeria carrying suspicious containers into the house, and a delivery driver remembered an odd conversation about insurance claims. Every fragment fit together, forming a web of undeniable evidence. Her fear, once paralyzing, had now sharpened her awareness. Every detail could be leveraged. Valeria, in her hubris, continued to flaunt their supposed victory, believing Marisol dead. One evening, during a private dinner with friends, she laughed about how the fire had solved everything, while Alejandro nodded in agreement, dismissing her arrogance. Unbeknownst to them, Marisol had managed to place a discreet recording device nearby. Listening to their conversation, she felt a grim satisfaction. Every careless word, at every bragging admission, became ammunition. Alejandro and Valeria had handed her the keys to their downfall. Marisol worked through nights filled with strategy, organizing the evidence into a meticulous dossier. Financial irregularities, suspicious transactions, hidden assets, and manipulative behavior, all documented, time-stamped, and backed by witnesses. She was patient, knowing that impulsive action could endanger her. Alejandro and Valeria were unpredictable and dangerous, but their arrogance was their Achilles' heel. The more they flaunted their perceived victory, the more exposed they became. She also trained herself to remain unnoticed, shadowing their movements through discreet surveillance and gathering insider reports from employees too intimidated to speak directly. Whispers of threats, manipulations, as in strange behaviors were collected and archived. Each revelation strengthened her case and her confidence. Alejandro, who once seemed untouchable, began to appear vulnerable in her eyes. Marisol's mind sharpened, transforming trauma into tactical advantage. The first small victories came in the form of corroborating evidence from unsuspecting witnesses. A delivery man recalled seeing Alejandro and Valeria in a secluded area discussing insurance and profit, while a former housekeeper confirmed noticing signs of a calculated plan weeks before the fire. Marisol compiled these accounts, layering each one with the physical evidence she had recovered, constructing an unassailable narrative. Her nights were long and filled with sleepless plotting, yet Marisol felt alive in a way she hadn't before. Fear had forged her into a strategist, as a silent predator operating from the shadows while Alejandro and Valeria continued their careless lives. She imagined the moment she would confront them, not with brute force, but with the law and the truth as her weapon. Each day brought her closer to justice. By the end of the second week, Marisol had a complete map of their crimes, arrogance, and vulnerabilities. She had recordings, witness statements, and digital trails that pointed unequivocally to their intent to harm her. Alejandro's and Valeria's belief in their own untouchability blinded them to the growing storm they had created. Marisol's bruised body and seared lungs were now badges of a survivor transformed into a calculating force, poised to turn the tables. She spent the final hours reviewing every detail, ensuring no gaps existed in her evidence. Each call to witnesses, each verification of messages, and each recording confirmed one unassailable truth. Alejandro and Valeria had underestimated her, and that miscalculation would cost them everything. She allowed herself a brief, triumphant smile. They had thought they were executing the perfect crime, but they had only orchestrated the rise of a relentless, unstoppable adversary. Marisol's determination was absolute. Every piece of evidence was a nail in their coffin, every witness testimony a hammer striking with precision. Her fear had been transformed into focus, her panic into strategy, and the memory of fire that had nearly claimed her life into an indelible motivation. Alejandro and Valeria were blind to the storm approaching, and Marisol intended to ensure that when it arrived, it would leave no escape, no excuses, and no survivors of their arrogance. As night fell over the city, Marisol finally allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. Her body ached, her mind buzzed with strategy, but she had survived. The fire that was meant to consume her had only ignited a determination stronger than any fear. Tomorrow would mark the next phase, moving from planning to execution. Alejandro and Valeria would soon realize that they had awakened a force far more dangerous than the flames they had set, and Marisol's rise from the ashes would be absolute. The sun rose over the city, but Marisol's mind was already awake, sharp and unrelenting. Tonight, Alejandro and Valeria would face the consequences of their arrogance, and every step had been meticulously planned. She reviewed her dossier once more, ensuring every recording, witness statement, and piece of evidence was airtight. There was no room for error. One misstep could allow them to slip away, but her confidence was solid. They had underestimated her for too long, and that mistake would be their undoing. Marisol's first move was subtle yet precise. She contacted the authorities under the guise of an anonymous tip, providing detailed directions to the location where Alejandro and Valeria would be that evening. She described their previous crimes, including financial fraud, manipulation, and most importantly, the attempted murder that had left her barely alive. The officer on the other line hesitated, but the specificity and corroboration of her evidence silenced doubt. She hung up, heart racing, knowing that her careful planning was about to pay off. Alejandro, unaware of the storm closing in, spent the day flaunting his perceived victory. He and Valeria moved through the city in arrogance, laughing about the fire and their perfect plan. But Marisol had ensured every step they took was tracked. Security cameras, discreet observers, and hidden microphones had captured their every word and movement. Every boast and every careless admission was being documented, ready to be used against them. Their sense of invincibility was their greatest weakness. Marisol dressed simply, her appearance unassuming yet precise, designed to keep her unnoticed as she approached the scene. She carried nothing but the essentials: her phone, the final set of recordings, and the confidence of someone who had already survived death. Each step toward the rendezvous point was deliberate, measured, as she blended into the city around her. The tension was almost palpable, every breath a silent preparation for what was to come. At the appointed location, Alejandro and Valeria arrived, smug and unaware of the evidence waiting to confront them. Marisol stayed hidden at first, observing. She could see the smugness in their faces, the arrogance that had blinded them for so long. They laughed, leaning on each other as if the world belonged solely to them, and she allowed herself a brief smile. They were finally within her reach, and every detail of their downfall had been orchestrated with precision. Suddenly, police cars arrived, lights flashing, and sirens muted but insistent. Alejandro and Valeria froze, shock rippling across their faces. Marisol stepped out from the shadows, her posture calm, her eyes blazing with determination. The officers approached, holding evidence packets, recording devices, and a list of charges. Alejandro's mouth opened in disbelief, words failing him as the reality of their situation hit. Valeria's smug expression faltered, fear overtaking her arrogance. Marisol remained silent, letting the weight of the evidence and the arrival of the authorities speak for her. The recordings, witness statements, and meticulous documentation were undeniable. Alejandro and Valeria had attempted to murder her, had plotted financial schemes, and had manipulated everyone around them. The law would no longer ignore their arrogance. The officers read the charges aloud, and Alejandro's defiance crumbled, replaced by desperate pleas and feigned ignorance. Valeria tried to protest, but her lies were drowned out by the evidence stacked against her. As Marisol felt a sense of calm triumph wash over her. This wasn't just revenge, it was justice. She had survived fire, betrayal, and deceit, and now she was witnessing the culmination of her patience, intelligence, and resilience. Alejandro and Valeria were handcuffed, their world of privilege and arrogance collapsing around them. The same people they had believed powerless to stop them had now ensured they would face the consequences of their actions. As the officers escorted Alejandro and Valeria to the vehicles, Marisol allowed herself a moment to breathe. The fear, pain, and panic that had consumed her in the fire had transformed into strength, strategy, and victory. She had turned every moment of terror into a calculated plan that had now come to fruition. Her mind, once clouded with smoke and fear, was now clear, focused, and unyielding. Marisol walked away from the scene, her steps steady, her body aching, but her spirit unbroken. She had reclaimed her life, her dignity, and her power. The fire that had been meant to destroy her had only forged her into something stronger, smarter, and more unstoppable. Alejandro and Valeria's downfall was complete, a testament to the strength and resilience that had been underestimated for far too long. Back in her own home, now secure and untouched by their previous malice, Marisol allowed herself to finally relax. She sat by the window, watching the city move on, indifferent yet vibrant, and she realized that she had become the author of her own fate. Every scar, every bruise, every sleepless night had been a stepping stone to this moment of vindication. She was no longer a victim, she was a survivor, a strategist, and a force that could not be ignored. The night fell, peaceful for the first time in weeks. Marisol reflected on the journey she had endured, the betrayal, the fire, the escape, and the careful plotting that had brought justice to those who had tried to end her life. She smiled softly, knowing that Alejandro and Valeria's arrogance had been their undoing. They had underestimated her, and in doing so, they had handed her the power to reclaim everything they had tried to steal. As she prepared for the days ahead, Marisol felt a profound sense of freedom. She had survived death, outwitted her enemies, and ensured that justice would be served. The house, the city, the life she had fought to protect. They were hers again, unshaken and secure. Alejandro and Valeria would face the consequences of their cruelty, and she would never again allow anyone to underestimate her strength or resolve. For Marisol, the fire had not ended her, it had awakened a power she had never fully realized. And now, with Alejandro and Valeria behind bars, she could finally breathe, fully alive and utterly unafraid. The ordeal had forged her into something new, something indestructible, a survivor whose story of triumph and justice would never be forgotten.